Okay, let's get going. Sure we'll get some late arrivals. It wouldn't be an ADHD webinar if we didn't, so we'll just let them in as they come. So welcome to the third monthly ADHD Remapped webinar. Special session tonight. Sarah, who I'll introduce a little later, is joining us. I'll talk a little bit more about what Sarah's here for. Just first, a little bit of admin. So we record these sessions, we post them on YouTube in a day or so's time, so that if you've come in late or you missed a session, you still get a chance to have a listen in. The recordings from previous sessions, if you've missed them, so there's one on curiosity and one on ADHD and me, that's me. They are available on my website, so adhdremapped.com events. And the recorded sessions are there for you to be able to click back and check out if you missed them last time. So today's session will be roughly 30 minutes of presentation, followed by a chance for Q&A, and then we have a kind of hard finish at 8 o'clock. Let everyone go off and, well, in my case, get their dinner. So tonight we have joining us Sarah Osborne from Soul Nutrition. So you should be able to see on your screen the advert from today's session. So Sarah is a nutritionist, she's a lecturer, she's a clinical supervisor, and from chatting with Sarah on a couple of different occasions, I know she has a personal connection to ADHD as well. I first watched Sarah, I was looking back in my emails actually to see when the event was, and it was September 2023, and she did a presentation on ADHD and nutrition, and I just found it really kind of captivating and so interesting. So when I got a chance to work with Sarah this evening, I was really excited for her to join us. So I'm going to stop sharing and then pass over sharing duties to Sarah. And I'm going to be positive and say that this is going to go without a hitch.
So have I gone forward?
Yeah, you have. Perfect.
Oh, that was probably the most seamless. That's so.
All positive thing.
Well, thank you so much, Matthew, for inviting me to talk to your group this evening. As Matthew said, my name's Sarah. I'm a bank-registered nutritionist. I'm also a mental health practitioner. I specialise in emotional eating, and I am currently partway through an ICF ADHD coaching certification. Which I'm doing just to sort of enhance my practice and make sure that in my clinical work with my nutrition clients, I'm giving them the most well-informed support that I possibly can. And as Matthew said, I'm mum and wife in a wonderfully neurodiverse family, which is the reason I actually do the work that I do. I retrained as a nutritionist after quite a long, difficult, challenging and unrewarding corporate career. And I thought perimenopause is a good time to launch into 3 years academic training and do something I wanted to do for a long time. And it was actually lockdown for us. It was 2020 that ADHD was first a term I really first became properly aware of and sort of entered our life. And the result of that was we're very fortunate that by halfway through 2021, both my husband and my son had a diagnosis and were on a treatment pathway. So I know we're a family where we've had, we're very fortunate that we've been through that journey already, where many people are sort of in that process. But it was a very, very challenging period. And for me, as a new nutritionist who was about to start a practice working with clients who had eczema and asthma, because that's what drew me to nutrition for myself, my personal journey. This sort of reframing process that we went through in terms of everything, really. I also put that reframing lens over when it came to my husband and my son's diet and their relationship with food. And this new information was actually incredibly helpful. It helped me to understand things that I had always been a bit of a mystery to me in terms of their relationship with food. So just before I sort of launch into the presentation tonight, I just wanted to say a couple of things that I always say in my presentations. My work in my clinical practice and in the lectures I do and the talks I give, are always around more about the way that having ADHD or other neurodivergent traits might be impacting a person's relationship with food and how I can support that relationship. And only then do we come to those sort of more detailed conversations about specific nutrients and the role of nutrition in health, in neurodivergent health, in mental health, and in physical health. So it's sort of a little bit the opposite of what people sometimes think I do. I'm not here to talk about the role of food in ADHD. It's more sort of the role of ADHD in food, if you like. I'm here talking tonight about something quite specific. It's about emotional eating. The work I do in my clinic ranges from the role of the link between ADHD and gut health. Lots of my clients come to me because they have very erratic gut health issues. They have a very erratic bowel issues. It can be quite common. Some clients are seeking help with sleep and mood. Some of my clients have really sort of severe food intolerances and lots of sort of different things that can actually be more common with neurodivergent traits. But tonight I'm talking specifically about emotional eating. So it's just one part of the work that I do in my clinical practice, but it's probably the one that most people ask me about. So I thought we'd sort of just top and tail this evening. Oh, that stopped me being able to go forward now. Oh, there we go. So I thought we'd just start with a very quick case study. Janice isn't this client's real name, but I'm just using it in this instance. But it sort of talks to you about the kind of, oh, have I lost the screen share now?
No, I can still see your screen.
Oh, I can't, I've lost that. Don't know how I get back to that. That's very strange. Sorry about
Sarah,
that.
do you want me to drive the slides from here, and then you can just kind of...
I've just managed to lose my own view of the screen share. Oh, there we go. Sorry.
You okay now?
So Janice is a client of mine. She's a female recently diagnosed with ADHD. She's in her 40s. She had a lifelong complicated relationship with food. As a child, she was labelled as a fussy eater from a young age due to limiting food preferences. That's a whole other topic I talk about. Fussy eating is one of my least favourite terms. It's sort of missing an awful lot of why somebody is selectively eating, but it's really common for me to see in clinic. So in adolescence, Janice discovered sweets, chocolate. She was able to have her own pocket money, buy her own food. She was in secondary school, alcohol, and her eating patterns became more and more irregular. She often didn't feel hungry at all. She wasn't eating at regular intervals, but when hunger struck, it was overwhelming. So she'd sort of go through a whole day, not have even thought really much about food, and then suddenly find herself ravenous and need to eat immediately. And this would leave little time to prepare a meal. So she found that increasingly she was relying on things that were quick and readily available, which in our modern world is very easy. So as Janice grew older, she developed significant challenges with shopping and cooking and meal prep. All these things became a little bit difficult. She even found towards sort of mid-30s, even going into a shop and looking at this huge array of food, she just didn't know what to have or where to start. She would then fixate on a particular type of food. In her case, it became overnight oats. She'd eat it repeatedly until she couldn't stand it anymore, and it had to go into the never eat again category. So her reliance on convenience food and takeaway started to contribute to her low energy levels because she was a little bit nutrient poor for a while. And then she became increasingly concerned about her appearance as a result of a limited diet and the effect that was having on how she felt that she looked. And that led her to try multiple diets. So for about 10 years, she did them all. In a diet, she'd stick with one for 4 or 5 weeks, maybe 5 to 6 weeks, and do really well, but then inevitably would drop off, and then she'd be unable to maintain any sort of consistency. Now Janice is in clinic. Her situation is she rarely feels actually hungry, but often eats large amounts of food in a short space of time. Sometimes until she feels really uncomfortably full. And this behaviour leaves her feeling guilty and ashamed, and then a cycle begins, and that further reinforces this sort of complicated relationship with food, and then we're back to sort of restricting and diet and a bit of an unhealthy cycle. Now, Janice is a particular client, but this and varieties of what I've just described there are something I see in clinic frequently, every week, in fact. It's quite a common picture. So I wanted to sort of look into what are some of the reasons why this is happening with Janice, and what is this pattern of emotional eating. So the definition of emotional eating is using food to soothe or suppress emotions rather than satisfy physical hunger. It's a common response to things like stress, sadness, boredom, or other emotional triggers. Emotional eating affects many people, a great many people, and it can be linked to stress, it can be linked to modern lifestyle. It is a little bit more common in neurodivergence, particularly ADHD. But this is a very judgment-free discussion, and my aim is just to increase awareness and to help us develop sort of balanced, more intuitive eating habits. So just before I move on, I wanted to sort of make it clear that emotional eating, as I think, isn't necessarily a good or bad thing. It's something we all do at various times, whether it's sort of getting to the end of the week on a Friday and thinking, oh, I'm not cooking, I just want to take away. In my case, that would be, Thai food, or, for somebody else, it could be a pizza, glass of wine. I just want to chill out and not have any effort tonight. That's an emotional decision I've made. That's no problem. That's absolutely fine. We're not robots. We're not supposed to eat in a superbly healthy, structured way all the time. We are intuitive creatures. It's when that decision then tips us into a position where we're doing that very regularly, or we've lost our ability to schedule our eating and make decisions about what we want to eat, rather than sort of just eating in a less mindful way. So what leads to emotional eating? There are, as I said, lots of triggers. Stress is a huge, is right up there. It's one of the main triggers, but boredom, I'd say, is right alongside it. Anxiety, sadness, or let me go into those sort of more emotional feelings like loneliness. It can be a really complex issue. But there are also thought processes and influences that can govern emotional eating. So I do lots of work with people who their emotional eating has actually become a real binge eating picture. That's the emotional eating when it's sort of tipped into a less balanced state. And I often see that all or nothing thinking. And we know that all or nothing thinking can be very prevalent with a neurodivergent neurotype, which can bring benefits, but it can also bring challenges. So the reason that Janice has sort of tried lots of diets, they've worked really well, very well for a short space of time and then stopped, is because that one little thing that tipped out of that quite structured way, or that diet, has then led to, that's it, the whole thing's gone now, we'll just sort of go back to where we were. So that sort of inflexibility can sometimes lead to that emotional eating pattern. A reward mentality associated with food and comfort as reward. We're often brought up that way. Eat this and then you'll have that. And it's usually eat something sort of healthy and good for you in a typical dinner, and the reward will be a dessert, some chocolate, some sweets. We have societal pressure and diet culture. We've survived and thrived on this planet as a species for billions of years. We're eating in a very different way to the way we're supposed to eat and live as a mammal on this planet, as part of this ecosystem. Even sort of concepts like breakfast, lunch, and dinner are our constructs. But these external expectations we've brought with our modern way of living, and about how we should look and how we should eat, these restrictions can often cause a backlash effect, where the foods that we have so plentifully in our food source, but are forbidden, become even more appealing. And neurodivergence and emotional regulation challenges. I'll talk about this more in a second, but difficulty processing emotions is obviously going to lead to a more emotional relationship with food. And in ADHD, we know that impulsivity may make this more prevalent. So I wanted to share some of the actual research and studies around this shortly, but I wanted to talk first about our modern diet, because as I said, we've lived on this planet for a very long time. We are a nomadic hunter-gatherer species. That's what we are. That's what our biochemistry is designed to deal with for 99.999% of the time that we've existed as a species and actually gone on to thrive. That's how we've done it. So our biochemistry is geared for that kind of behaviour. Food would not have been easy to come by. It would have been seasonal. There'd have been periods in that seasonal year when food was particularly difficult to come by. We'd have faced climate issues, competition, predators. So we have these sort of signals in our brain to tell us, right, okay, time to get up, leave the cave. I know it's cold. I know it's challenging. I know you're leaving loved ones behind. I know it might be a long time, till you find food, or you might have to, as we've sort of become more, as we brought agriculture into our world, we still had to sort of get up very early, so face crop issues, face weather that would sort of leave us without the rewards of what we'd sowed for many months. So all these challenges, we need a very strong motivation to get up and keep doing this, and that comes in the form of dopamine. And the reward that we get is there to teach us to happy behaviour. So it's there to say, great, I know that was difficult. I know you didn't like it, but here's the sense of reward you're going to get for having done that, so that you repeat that, so you can live and so you can thrive and feed others. And that's why we get that feel good after eating. What dopamine is actually doing is rewarding us for behaviour that it's taught us. So that's a less difficult thing to achieve when all we have to do is go into our kitchen, open our fridge, and there's a Magnum. We haven't had to do all that work and use all that behaviour pattern to get that reward. So dopamine's a little bit, right, okay. In order to keep us going, dopamine is that molecule of more. So it really doubles down and reinforces behaviour when we actually have that achievement, when we find that food. So we're facing a difficulty here with our modern diet compared to our biochemistry, and that dopamine's saying, okay, well done, that was good, you did that, there's the reward, do that again, because that's its job. So emotional eaters often chase this feeling and end up with these sort of short-term fixes of dopamine, where it thinks it's doing us a really big favour, driving us towards foods that are high in calories, high in fat, high in sugar, that it thinks it's giving us this distinct survival advantage. It's not recognising that there's little nutrient status there. Our appetite hormones like leptin, which is there to tell us that we're full, and ghrelin, which is there to tell us that we're hungry, are key in regulating our appetite. We don't just feel hungry or full. We have a signal going to our brain from parts of our body telling us this. And emotional eating can disrupt these hormones, making it much harder for us to recognise real hunger cues. And then we have to factor in blood sugar dysregulation, which is huge, because the minute we get a bit of blood sugar dysregulation, that can further cause us to confuse appetite and hunger signals. And blood sugar crashes can also mimic symptoms of anxiety, which can then further drive us towards those emotional eating behaviours. There are very strong links between diet culture and emotional eating. Diet culture's influence is absolutely huge. We're constantly bombarded with messages about restricting foods or good or bad foods. This food is good and will make you feel good, and this food is bad. And that can be anything these days, from a donut to seed oils to a can of tuna. And there's lots of sort of different morality around foods these days, which can make it extremely confusing. And restrictive dieting is common in our modern world. It hasn't been, and like I said, our biochemistry is not there to understand what restrictive dieting is. But what restrictive dieting relies on is motivation. It relies on you to say to yourself, this food is bad for me, I won't eat it, I will stop craving it. And the problem is, when you try and use motivation against something like dopamine, you're probably not going to win. You'll just simply desire the thing you're trying to restrict even more. And then we're in a sort of food guilt and shame cycle. So I wanted to look at some of the research actually here that looks at some of the reasons that there might be a slightly higher correlation between ADHD and binge eating, and is that supported by evidence? And there is some evidence to show that there have been some studies to show some links, and they kind of hone in on these sort of 5 main areas. Impulsivity, which I don't need to talk too much about because we're very aware of that link with ADHD and impulsivity. But that's a key driver that's sort of quite well established now in our understanding. And I've talked about emotional dysregulation, but there are also some neurobiological mechanisms. So ADHD and binge eating share some common neurobiological features. And that's particularly around certain brain areas associated with reward processing and impulse control. So that's where we look at studies that have taken place, everything from animal studies to human sort of observational studies about relationships with food. And we can see some common themes. Body dissatisfaction and weight concerns. People with ADHD can experience higher levels of body dissatisfaction according to some studies. All studies are limited. I want to make absolutely clear here that we sort of don't read one study and think, oh, that's told as a fact. All studies have limitations. All studies just sort of give us information that we can maybe use to our advantage, but they don't very often show a cause and effect relationship. But there are some studies that show that there are maybe higher levels of concern, and that can be going right back to lots of different reasons. Relationships at home, school, rejection, dysphoria. There's lots of different reasons that might be. But they can really exacerbate a bit of a disordered eating pattern, and we do sort of see a binge eating picture emerging, which I think, from my 2 years of experience of working in clinic, it's not the same as binge eating disorder in a disordered eating clinic. I think that we need to look much more at this sort of impulsivity, emotional dysregulation, dopamine impact than sort of classic binge eating disorder. I do think the two things are different. There's a developmental trajectory as well. So what that means is that researchers looked at emerging ADHD symptoms in childhood, and sometimes in certain cohorts then being indicators to potentially predict binge eating behaviours in adolescence. And so what can the impact of emotional eating be on things like metabolism, mood, and then that binge restrict cycle? So metabolism, emotional eating often leads to overeating, especially high calorie, nutrient poor foods. And this can slow the metabolism over time. We're very dependent, our microbiome in particular, on foods that are very high in fibre. That would normally have contributed the vast majority of our diet. So we're sort of tipping our metabolism more in one direction than another, generally speaking, across the Western world in particular. Mood regulation, so emotional eating may provide temporary relief, but in the long run, it can actually worsen mood for lots of different reasons, sleep being one in particular, and it can create those cycles then of guilt and shame attached to food, which can lead to sort of low self-esteem. And that binge restrict cycle, what it will often lead to is sort of that kind of all or nothing thinking coming back in, where we'll say, right, okay, that's it. I'm cutting out coffee, or I'm cutting out sugary drinks, or I'm going to go sugar-free for sort of 60, 90 days, because that's how we're taught, that's what's all around us. But the minute we sort of have that feeling of deprivation and that emotional tension, it will more often than not eventually actually tip us closer to a binge eating picture. There's also an impact on gut health and that gut-brain connection. So imbalances in appetite regulation, overeating or even undereating, will throw off those natural hunger and fullness cues. Those hunger and fullness cues from things like leptin and ghrelin are very linked to our microbiome. We know that the microbes in our gut have an enormously important relationship in terms of those signals working properly and that gut-brain axis. So a disrupted microbiome, which we see when we have a less varied diet, can often affect our emotions, our sleep, our focus and our attention. What we know about the gut microbiome for certain is that the gut is doing much more talking than it is listening. And probably about 80% of the talking, the brain seems to be receiving information from the gut much more than it's sending it. So our microbiome really is in the driving seat, and including when it comes to appetite. So we can take some steps towards mindful and intuitive eating, and they are steps. Often clients will come to me in clinic and say, can you put me on an intuitive eating program? And I say, intuitive eating is the long-term goal. It's not the actual program. Getting from a sort of emotional eating state to an intuitive eating state is a step-by-step process. And I've kind of sort of tried to put some of the steps here that I use in my clinic in the order that I tend to sort of go with my clients over a period of weeks and months. And building awareness is the first step, starting by identifying those emotional triggers for eating, using mood and food journals to track patterns, not calories, not food, but patterns, can really help to gain an insight into what's driving eating habits. So guided journaling is really helpful. And practicing mindfulness, that I know is easier said than done, but there are some really good tools that you can use to actually, rather than sort of saying, oh, be mindful, that's not easy, especially a particular sort of mindfulness that we think of as mindfulness is too difficult to achieve. Kind of empty your mind and just sort of that's not really helpful. But using certain tools to help you pause when you feel the urge to eat emotionally are helpful. So I have a sort of 3-question step that I ask them, especially with my younger clients as well. When you find the urge to eat emotionally, so not when you're eating structurally, so this is not to be used when you're having a breakfast, a lunch, or a dinner, or a meal. This is when you're sort of have had something to eat and are then looking for more, or you're just sort of opened a biscuit and suddenly you know you're about to have the whole packet. Or you've got something really healthy to have in the fridge, but you're reaching for something else instead. So that emotional urges come in. And to help you sort of just pause, I ask my clients to sort of actually, sometimes it can help to actually put your hand on your heart at this point and just say, okay, hang on a second, am I actually hungry? Or am I feeding an emotion here? So how I ask my clients to do this is to say, okay, hang on a second. Am I hungry or am I bored? Do I actually just need to move? Am I seeking dopamine? Probably. Movement is your quickest way of getting dopamine. So do I just need to move for 5 minutes? That can be anything from, I've got some of my younger clients who will sort of drop down and do 10 press-ups, or there's an actual movement I teach in clinic which helps the body to access, the mind to access dopamine. A quick brisk walk if it's nice, if it's the weather we are now I'm in Manchester, so probably something indoors, 10-minute, yoga practice, anything, just some sort of movement. If not, am I bored? Am I bored? Do I need to do something which will stimulate me? This is something else I can do rather than opening the cupboard. Even if this is where I will say to some of my family members where we have got sort of younger clients, I will say, even if that means sort of getting on the iPad for 10 minutes, or doing something, I encourage my clients to have things they can sort of pick up quite quickly and just do something to relieve boredom. And we look a lot at what those things can be. But boredom is another one. The third one is, am I thirsty? For thirst cues, it's the same sort of process in the brain. So have a drink. Doesn't necessarily have to be, ice water. Just have a drink, try and quench your thirst, give yourself a minute. If after those 3 things you're still sort of feeling hungry, then you probably are hungry. That's probably because you haven't eaten in a structured way during the day, but that's okay. It's just recognizing and taking that moment. Balancing blood sugar is absolutely key. So focusing on meals that are rich in fibre, healthy fats and proteins to prevent blood sugar spikes is the key to most of the work I do. Trying to get that macronutrient profile right will actually solve half the problems at least. That can be a little bit easier than having, a balanced meal doesn't need to be wild Alaskan court salmon and, a portion of spinach and steamed broccoli. It can be yogurt with some nuts and a couple of berries on. It can be apple with some peanut butter. That would constitute a snack that's got protein and fats and carbohydrates, and will help move on from those cravings. I use the word nourish in my clinic a lot. We want to sort of move from using food either to sort of just relieve boredom, or sometimes even, kind of punish ourselves a little bit. Sometimes my clients are in a very, very difficult relationship with the food. We want to look at food as something to nourish your microbiome, to help you have more energy, to help you have more focus, to help you have better sleep. So eating more whole and unprocessed foods that support your gut health, such as, increasing fermented foods like yogurt and sauerkraut, finding the fruits and veg that you like and having access to those. I'm a big fan of using convenience food for your advantage. So my clients have freezers that have bags of frozen berries in and bags of frozen veg. Using tins of tuna, because these are things that are accessible, they're in the kitchen, they're great. You're not skipping nutrition when you're doing that at all. You're just feeding and nourishing yourself. Again, those dopamine boosting activities are so important. One of the analogies I use in clinic quite a lot, and I speak about one of my typical things I didn't used to understand about my husband, and now I do, is that when he was coming home from a job quite far away in Cheshire, every day he'd not have enough petrol to get all the way home. So he would stop at a small garage on the way. I think it might have been an Esso garage. And he'd come home and he'd kick off about the fact he'd put expensive petrol in the car rather than going to Costco, where it's cheaper and it's better quality fuel. And we had this conversation on repeat. And I'd say, why don't you just go to Costco, on Saturday and fill up? And, we know now why. So instead, he was in this loop of having to go to this garage that he resented. So he'd only put £5 in, which would just be enough to get home. And when we've got emotional eating, we can be sort of doing the same. We can be using those cheap sources of dopamine to get a little bit of a hit in our diet, sort of each evening or at some point during the day. Sometimes it's midday for clients, sometimes it's morning. If you're doing something once or twice a week that's going to really boost your dopamine, you're already going to help with that situation. So we look at things like what's going to really be enjoyable, whether it's ice water swimming, having some cold showers. One of our clients restarted horse riding, and that's been an absolute game changer. She was going to the gym 3 or 4 times a week and hated it. Martial arts, whatever it is that sort of is movement, it's a hobby, it's whether it's listening to music, whatever it is, getting that hit of dopamine 2 or 3 times a week that's good quality will stop using those cheaper daily hits. Self-compassion is really important, being kind to yourself. I know that can sound incredibly simplistic. It's a process. And it's about sort of finding those ways to introduce self-compassion and being kind to yourself. One way I encourage my clients to do that is to simply remove the morality from food. There isn't good food and bad food, there's just food. There isn't good behaviour and bad behaviour, there's just behaviour. There's just where you're at now and where you want to be. So even just that is even though it doesn't sound it is self-compassion. It's saying, I'll sometimes get my clients to have the food they use as a reward first and then have their food after, just to mess with dopamine a bit and say, okay, hang on a second, so that I can nourish myself with this as well, but then go on to have food that's going to really feed my cells and my brain and sustain me. And establishing those non-food coping mechanisms is really important. So developing a balanced emotional coping strategy, really incorporating things like deep breathing, journaling, talking to a friend will actually help with structured eating habits. Having an ADHD coach that's really sort of well informed is a kind of non-negotiable for me when I'm working with clients, because the two things really sort of feed into one another. Even if it's accessing ADHD coaching through online sessions, using some of the charities that have support groups. If you haven't got access to work or having one-to-one coaching's not practical at this stage, there are lots of sort of ways you can go and places you can go to sort of start to really help establish those non-food coping mechanisms. So emotional eating is complex, but it's very, very possible to begin to break free from the cycle and understand the triggers and the role of hormones and that brain chemistry and the role that the gut plays. And shifting from emotional eating into a mindful and intuitive eating is a journey, but it is possible. I know I do this every week. It is a small, gradual step-by-step process that can bring big changes. the shiny sort of all or nothing fancy new diet that's promising, you know, incredible results. Very rarely actually works. It is sort of just finding little things to make sure you're hydrated, you're nourished, and you're sort of getting those practices that are going to then tip into your food behaviour will be far more beneficial. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you. I know that was a lot, and I hope that you got something of value from that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I put my video on. There we go. I'm back. I had a couple of really kind of like things that really struck home with me, and my partner's on the call this evening. She would have rolled her eyebrows, particularly at one of them. But like stress and low mood have always been a link for eating with me, and kind of like reaching for typically like high fat, high sugar, kind of like biscuits or chocolate, that sort of thing. That really kind of hit home with me. But then this is the one that my partner would have rolled her eyes at, was this all or nothing, you know, kind of going very obsessively vegan for a period of time, and then the complete opposite, and being obsessively kind of like carnivorous diet, and just yeah, and the things that are just so unsustainable. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you was about gut biome. I've read a few things recently about gut biome and ADHD, and kind of like the quite distinct differences in ADHD and kind of like neurotypical gut biomes. I'm wondering whether or not you think that is a behavioral, or whether or not it's kind of actually like biological.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and there is so much. I think most of the research in the future is sort of going to be looking at that, not just for you know, for ADHD, but for everything. There's sort of cancer trials that are looking at the relationship between the gut. There's so much we don't understand, but there are some trends that are emerging. There's nothing that's made me think, oh, that's really conclusive in terms of, you know, that particular species being sort of low or absent. There are some really good studies that are emerging that show us that bifidobacterium and lactobacillus in particular are absolutely crucial, but we've known that for a while. I did lots of gut testing over 2 years with my clients, and I definitely saw certain species that there was definitely a pattern. They were sort of much lower. That's usually because the gut microbiome, I sort of think of it as a playground. With all the kids come out for playtime, and then we get certain playground bullies that, you know, are bigger than the others, and they sort of dominate. They take all the games. They're in the middle of the playground, and then little shy ones end up sort of hanging around the edge there, just keeping to themselves in the corner and not showing up. And we do see quite a few species like that. You know, things like Coprococcus and Akkermansia. The problem is these are really important. They have a really important job to do. So when they're not sort of coming out to play, and they're not being encouraged, and they're not being fed, to put it bluntly, then we do start to see some real imbalances. We've no evidence yet to show whether that's a sort of cause or effect relationship. We do know there might be some sort of correlation. So we don't know which came first, chicken or egg. We won't do for quite a while, I don't think, but it's a really interesting area of research. What I would say is, again, you know, the next new fancy probiotic's not going to sort that issue out. Supplementation, we could do a whole other, you know, sort of talk on that. I know it's a really big topic. Probiotics, you do the last place I go with my clients, unless it's something to do more with sort of migraines or skincare, to be honest. For general gut health, it really is about, you know, fibre, really is about trying to get as much fibre in your diet as possible, which, you know, people always think of veg straight away, but nuts, seeds, chia seeds, you know, kefir yogurt's known to be an amazing feeder of the microbiome. And there's Dr. Miguel Mateas has done some great studies about sort of neurodivergent populations and kefir and food and berries. So that's what I would be trying to do. And what I do know is that when we do get a more balanced microbiome, we do see improvements in sleep, in focus, and attention. So it's a key area of work. But the, you know, expensive gut testing, fancy, you know, well marketed products, that would be my sort of last place to go.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think often, just probably for this whole like clickbait kind of article culture, the headline is almost like this is causing ADHD, and if you can cure your gut biome, then goodbye ADHD. But it's really not about that, is it? It's about intensity of characteristics that maybe are kind of like, not particularly beneficial.
Yeah, and it really is about that chicken and egg situation. What we know about our microbiome is, this is a species that lives in us and with us, but it is a community that is very responsive to our environment. So when we look at studies of for instance, the Hadza tribe, which is a nomadic hunter-gatherer tribe that lives in parts of Africa, that's the closest thing we have to our actual environmental how we would have been originally. And they live in they have a diet that's very different from the winter and the summer months, and their microbiome doesn't look the same in those, two periods. So our modern diet is really what's dictating our microbiome, not so much sort of the other way around. There's been lots of studies around autism and certain species, but I'm always wary of things that say this has caused this and therefore this could cure that. We're not looking to cure ADHD anyway. We're looking to support some of the ways that having ADHD, particularly in a neurotypical world, has maybe left some issues around food, sleep, mood, and what we can do to improve that. And diet's a very overlooked area. And balancing your microbiome will go a long way to helping with that.
Yeah. And I suppose, although it's not an easy change to have a like healthy, sustainable diet for some people, it is one of the most accessible things that we can literally do starting tomorrow.
It really is, and I think there's two things I'd say about that. One, it's the easiest thing for us to control. So diet is the thing that we control when we can't control other things. It can be the first thing we go to, and that's why we can sometimes end up with that real sort of selective eating, especially in childhood. When everything else feels, especially for younger children, when they're in school and they feel like they've got no control over anything, they can subconsciously transfer that. But yeah, on the flip side of that, it is the single biggest factor that we can use for our epigenetics, for our microbiome. We have this huge power at our disposal, and it doesn't need to be complicated, and it doesn't need to be organic, and it doesn't need to be expensive. It can be done at one of the first places I go is sort of looking at my client's kitchen and saying, right, what convenience foods can we use to our advantage? Like I said, frozen foods, jarred foods, canned foods, perfect. They're not skipping nutrition to sort of open a tin of beans, open a tin of tuna, sort of put them together on a plate and have a little, sort of fish bean salad, or blending things. These aren't cutting corners. There's so much food morality. It really is. People are asking me, panicking about which oils to use when they're cooking, but they're not getting the basic protein that they need. So yeah, it's easier than people think to put a couple of things in your kitchen, a couple of things in your food source each day, but it'll start immediately to feed your microbiome. And we do, see quite quick changes just from introducing new fibres and things like that. We don't need to sort of revolutionise your diet overnight.
Yeah, so it's incremental change, isn't it? It's not kind of, being perfect from day one, which perfectionism again with ADHD is a big thing. Thank you so much. I was planning on opening up to everybody. If anyone has any questions, if you want to raise your hands, or if you're not comfortable chatting, just pop a question in the chat and I can ask for you. Hi, Jane.
Hi, yeah, I've got a question. So I was interested in the high protein conversation, Sarah, and I know that you were saying about avoiding processed foods, but the thing that helps me massively are high protein things like shakes, yogurts, and the protein bars. What are your thoughts on those?
Thank you, Jane. And that's a really good question. And we do need to be really practical. There's no point giving advice that's not, easy for somebody to follow and implement. So the sort of stage one is make sure you are accessing protein. That's sort of job one. And if that is initially in the form of a shake or a bar, then it's better that than a Snickers bar or, a can of Coke or some Red Bull. You are getting protein. I do teach my clients how to make really good shakes, and sometimes that, that will often include protein powder. I tend to use those more at the end of the day than at the beginning of the day. I know it can seem a bit easy to sort of make a protein shake in the morning, and if you're doing that rather than skipping breakfast, then absolutely do that, definitely, because a protein shake rather than no breakfast, there's no competition there. But a protein shake's quite good, especially with my younger clients at the end of the day when you're doing less digesting anyway. What we want to do is sort of train our digestive system to be doing its job, because the more our digestive system's doing what it's supposed to do, the more that intuitive eating will come in. I'm allowed to talk about my son, he doesn't mind me sharing this story. When he got his diagnosis, he was just finishing his A-levels, and his diet consisted of about 3 muffins for lunch, because by then we had the app had just come in, and I could see 2 or 3 of those massive chocolate bars he'd buy from B&M Bargains on the way home. Then he'd stop at the garage and get some Maryland cookies, and then swill those down with 2 Red Bulls. And I used shakes to knock that on the head. Shakes were my absolute tool. So I would make him a very, very sweet tasting chocolate shake made from almond milk with 2 dates in and some raw cacao powder. And blend that together, and then I put a scoop of protein powder in and hand him a really chocolatey, sweet tasting shake. Now, what that was doing, that was giving him that sweet hit, but it wasn't ultra processed food. It wasn't all those added sugars. So quite quickly, his dopamine system started to really, really calm down. And it only took about 6 weeks to 2 months before he wasn't really chasing that sugar hit anymore. And he doesn't do that now. He gets dopamine from lots of other sources, which is typical for a 21-year-old, but sugar's not an issue at all. So it's a case of, is it better than what you'd be doing otherwise? And then we get to, okay, are there good, better and best sort of sources of those shakes and bars? And so I like those sort of products that are made by dietitians and nutritionists. I always sort of go to those kind of products. So Deliciously Ella is I always look for her products in the supermarket. Dr. Megan, I'll say Megan Fox, that's the famous actress, isn't it? The one, her product range is called Bio and Me, or Bio Me. There's another product as well, which is really good, not Deliciously Ella. When it comes to shakes, if you're having a Huel at the moment, okay, great, because you've got protein in there. If you want to sort of do a slightly better version of that, then, companies like Garden of Life and Form do really lovely forms of protein. So it's really about sort of, is it better than what you'd be doing without it? And then what can you add to that? So if you're sort of having a Huel, can you have an apple with it? Can you have a handful of nuts at the same time? What can you sort of layer onto that that's going to actually also really get you some whole food while you're having your shake, so your body is using its digestive mechanism to break them down, and also give you a bit of added fibre and protein. So sort of start by adding in rather than, I don't ever do restrict, replace or remove in my clinic. Those words never. So if somebody's sort of having a Huel every day for lunch, I go, great, what can we have with that that's going to really sort of, max out the benefits of that?
Thank you. That's really helpful. I kind of have a secondary question now because of that, which is that a lot of the stuff that I end up having that's like that has got sweeteners in instead of sugars. A, because I'm diabetic, but B, because it's lower calorie. So a sweetener's bad for us.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And you've just answered part of my question. The first thing I would say when somebody said is sweetener's bad for us, the second thing I would ask after that is, are you diabetic? Because there's a different answer. And that would be different if you're at what stage in sort of that diabetes journey you asked, if you're type 1 diabetic compared to sort of type 2, if you're medicated. And at your age, there's no sweeteners versus sugar definitive answer to that. It depends. For some people, sweeteners are a benefit, particularly if they're things like stevia. But or for some people, it's actually better to be having sugar than it is to be having a sweetener, depending on what their blood glucose regulation sort of is already doing. What I would say is don't worry, don't get too sort of tied up in that, and don't worry too much about that. Just look at what you're doing while you're having that sugar or that sweetened drink or beverage. If you can have that thing that contains those sugars with some protein, that's the bigger question I'd be wanting to sort of look at, as opposed to whether it's a sugar or a sweetener. And what can you have in terms of some good fats and some good proteins that will slow down the breakdown of that. There are some people that talk about, sweeteners being less healthy, being a neurotoxin, that kind of thing. I'd steer away from worrying about that too much, and just more about, what's your body doing with what you've just had, and how can you help boost that mechanism, and how can you help slow down that release and actually have a benefit to what you're eating, rather than getting too caught up in ingredients. Ultra processed foods don't contain much nutrition. So for that reason, you wouldn't want them to be a huge part of your diet, but they are in our food source. There's no point sort of demonizing them and telling people to cut out cans of Coke. What we want to do is sort of gear people towards more whole food and more balance, and making sure that if you're introducing something with something, that's the thing I would focus on.
That's really helpful.
Oh, I think I've lost you a little bit there, but I'm really pleased about that. That's good.
You're breaking up a little, Jane. But thank you so much for your questions. We're just on the edge of time. And I just wanted to see if anyone else had a question they'd like to ask before we finish. Hi, Shirley. I'll ask you to unmute there. There you go.
Shirley, you're on mute.
You're still on mute, Shirley, if you have a question.
My dog just opened my door. Sorry, my border collie can open the door from the outside. Hi, Shirley. Oh, cannot unmute.
Oh, that's a shame. Anyone else? In fact, Shirley, if you can ask the question quickly in the chat, Sarah can try and answer. We just have a couple of minutes left.
I just wanted to thank Sarah a lot, because I don't know why I accept more the other parts of ADHD, but I really thought that it was a lack of motivation on my part, the binge eating, and the fact that you said that it is not completely my fault. It's
Sorry, I don't know whether you can hear me, but yeah.
it was really helpful. So thanks a lot for this, Sarah, really.
That means, is that Shirley? Sorry.
That was Barbara just now.
Do you know, I'm so pleased, because that's one of the first things that I say in my clinic, is that this is your biochemistry, this is your brain, this is our modern world and our modern diet. Most definitely not your fault. We're all facing a bit of a battle when it comes to food and relationships. But with ADHD, you're fighting a battle with no with no gloves and no help. It can be really difficult, but with the right support, it's very possible to make those changes. But you really are sort of trying to run uphill. And I have this in my own household. When I said at the beginning about putting that new information over me, it was very much about that. It was saying, okay, is that why? I've done a really nutritious meal for my husband. It's on the table, but he's picked up 2 McDonald's on the way home, and he's nipping out to get some stuff from the garage before it shuts. Why is that? When we know, and we made massive changes. My meals just were not dopaminergic enough. So I made them better. But no, it's not. It's complex for all of us, but it's particularly complex when you have that sort of added that added information. So I'm glad that's helped.
Thank you for that, Barbara. Do we have time just for a quick kind of couple of pointers on a question in the chat. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Shirley asked, what could you do if someone is always taking caffeine because they have low energy? What could you do food-wise to counteract or combat that?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and caffeine's a really big topic. It's often what people have sort of used for stimulation, and of course, lots of my clients are medicated as well, and that can really affect appetite. So with caffeine, try and have something to eat with it or around it is the biggest sort of game changer. Again, sort of don't try and sort of go straight to the restrict, because you know you again, restricting's never a good answer. Sort of having caffeine, having something with that caffeine, having something to sort of help balance out what's going to happen with your cortisol, sort of simply put, and then the knock-on effect that will have. Start with something you really like, that's okay, and then try and make it sort of something a little bit sort of balanced and nourishing. Chasing that caffeine energy, it's quite something I'm familiar with. You know, when I was studying, the last 12 months of my study, my clinical hours and dissertation were caffeine fueled. It's not a really sustainable sort of energy, so we need to use foods that are going to really help feed us to get proper energy, and then we're not relying on caffeine for that. And that will always come from those complex carbohydrates. So you know, it really will come from, you know, well, fruit and veg would be the first port of call. So having a piece of fruit with your coffee is a really good step, because you're going to be using those nutrients, and then making sure you've got good fats and protein where possible. So a bit of peanut butter and some banana before you have your coffee, something like that.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Sarah. And from everyone that's been on the call tonight, I'm sure everyone shares my thanks. So thanks for your time tonight, and thanks for all the information, and thanks to everyone else for joining.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Appreciate you, Sarah. And yeah, you can find Sarah at soulnutrition.co.uk if you want to know a little bit more about what she does. Okay, thank you all. Take care.
Thank
Good
you.
night. Bye-bye.
Bye.